Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Kevin Ochsner, who's a professor of psychology at Columbia University, on emotion regulation and the brain. Dr. Ochsner received his PhD in psychology from Harvard University, where he also received postdoctoral training in social psychology. He later received additional training in functional neuroimaging at Stanford University, where he subsequently held the position of a research scientist. He's currently a professor of psychology at Columbia University and director of the Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. His lab studies the psychological and neural processes involved in emotion, self-regulation, person perception, and their interactions. He's received various awards for his research and teaching, including the American Psychological Association's Division III New Investigator Award, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society's Young Investigator Award, and the Columbia University's Distinguished Faculty Award. So I now turn to our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Kevin Ochsner. So welcome, Kevin. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thanks for inviting me to talk with you.
Anytime. What I'd like to ask you about today, and what I think a lot of people would like to know, is what got you first started studying emotion in the first place? Can you tell us a bit about that journey?
Sure. I guess for most people, or at least in my case, it starts when I was just a grade school student. And I started noticing that so many people's emotional reactions seem to be a product of their life history. So whether it was in my family or even my friends in the neighborhood or in classes. And I found myself trying to figure out what their history was that led them to have the experiences that they had today. And although that was in some sense the seed that grew into the career I have now, one twist is that I didn't realize how much I was interested in this until I was in grad school studying something else entirely. Well, it's not something else entirely. I was studying memory and attention, and I was studying that because when I was in college, I was an engineering and English major, and I took as an elective what now would be called mind, brain, and behavior. I loved it. One of the professors got me working in her lab. I thought that was really fun, but she studied attention, and I worked in a couple other labs that studied memory, and I thought, this is really cool. But I didn't realize that what I thought was really cool was working in those labs, not necessarily the content of the science. And I went to grad school to study memory and attention, and not that those aren't perfectly worthy topics to study. They're wonderful. They just weren't for me. And about 2 months into grad school, I realized I needed to study emotion. But I hadn't until that point realized you could do that as a career. And from then, I started slowly but surely changing my trajectory away from straight cognitive phenomena to studying emotion and social behavior more broadly.
Very interesting. So that actually leads me to the next question I want to ask you, which is a bit about your work now on emotion. So your work has really pioneered this field that's looked at how can our brain play a role in either, kind of harnessing or reining in our emotions or really amplifying them. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you see as some of the most fundamental discoveries about neuroscience and as it relates to emotion regulation. So how does our brain really play a role in harnessing our feelings?
Well, that's a great question. And I wish it was one I could answer in 3 sound bites. I'll do my best to sort of boil down 2 or 3 things that I think are particularly cool. So one is has to do with a particular way of regulating your emotion that's captured by everyday aphorisms like every dark cloud has a silver lining or look on the bright side and so on. These aphorisms capture the idea that by changing the way you think about the world, you can change your emotional response to it. And that particular skill that we seem to have really captured my interest. And I wanted to understand how did that happen in the brain so that we can understand not just behaviorally that it does work, but at a slightly more mechanistic level, how does it work? What is actually going on inside the brain when we find the silver lining in the dark cloud? And we've used functional magnetic resonance imaging as our primary tool here, which allows us to look at what parts of the brain have more blood flow when you're having particular kinds of thoughts or feelings. And what we've found in my laboratory and now dozens of other laboratories around the world is that when you elicit an emotional response, you're activating parts of the brain that are often evolutionarily old and they, in a kind of a bottom-up, driven by the world kind of way, trigger an emotional response. But then if you want to effortfully change the way you think about it, to find that silver lining, you use evolutionarily newer parts of the brain up here in your frontal lobe. It's the lobes of the brain behind the frontal bone of your skull, which in me, not the hairless wonder here, is quite prominent. And these areas of the frontal lobe are involved in generating a story, creating a new narrative for the meaning of a situation that then kind of harnesses activation of these subcortical systems and shifts them around as a function of the way you're thinking about the world. So if you think about a bad situation like visiting your sick uncle in the hospital who just had a surgery, you focus on the fact that, oh, he could be getting better, he could be getting well. These frontal regions will come online and might diminish activity in a brain structure like the amygdala. But if instead you think, oh, Uncle Larry is in a great deal of pain, he might get much worse, he's going to be devastated, it really stresses me out, you'll be using these same frontal regions, but now you're amping up activity in the systems important for triggering your initial emotional response. So it's not like there's any simple idea that, oh, you turn on the frontal lobe, you turn off emotion. It's not like that. It's all about the meaning that you ascribe, or the way in which classically in psychology you'd say you appraise the meaning of a situation that's important. So that the first, I think, fundamental insight is that when you're cognitively reframing the meaning of an emotional situation, you're relying on parts of the frontal lobe that are important for all other kinds of higher cognitive function in general. Language, holding information in working memory, controlling the focus of your attention. It's really pretty much the same regions. And in that sense, these cognitive forms of emotion regulation are an instance of using cognitive control over emotion instead of cognitive control over memory or cognitive control over attention. So that to me was actually kind of profound, because we really didn't know how emotion regulation, especially of this sort, was going to be organized. Another thing that I thought was particularly interesting was that this ability to cognitively reframe the meaning of a situation would work all the way down to the level of very evolutionarily old brain structures that we might not have thought our everyday thoughts and reasoning could penetrate. So for a while, the received wisdom was that this brain structure, the amygdala, would lay down, for example, traces of a fear memory that were indelible. Joseph Ledoux is famous at NYU for doing the seminal studies in this regard. So when we started wading in here and doing these emotion regulation studies, it was big news that you could just modify the amygdala's response simply by changing quickly the way that you think about something. Because the idea was, oh my gosh, if the amygdala is going to respond to something that's gruesome or nasty, that's almost an obligatory response that will hijack your brain. In fact, that was the popular term for science writers like Daniel Goleman. They'd say, you have an amygdala hijacking. Oh no, raid on your brain. But it turned out it's not quite so simple as that. As alluring and interesting as those kinds of metaphors are, as we all know, they're useful up to a point. It turns out the reality is a bit more complicated. Okay. So that, I think, is the second thing that's really cool, is that just by changing your high-level thoughts about the meaning of an emotion eliciting situation, you can penetrate all the way down to even your brainstem and change the way really evolutionarily old, primitive brainstem centers are encoding whether something's threatening or not.
Interesting.
Maybe that's a long-winded answer. But.
No, not at all, not at all. It does make me think a lot about how, I mean, you're giving these really interesting examples about how people used to think about emotion and the way in which we would or would not be able to regulate it. And it just kind of draws back to this notion of, well, what is emotion and emotion regulation in the first place? We can relate to it in our everyday lives. We have these beliefs about how emotions, like you said, hijack our brain. But really trying to define these two terms is really thorny for a lot of researchers. And I wonder, for you especially, looking at this through the lens of neuroscience, how do you really tease apart what emotion and emotion regulation is? And can the brain actually support this distinction in your mind?
Well, I love how you ask such simple questions, June, and they're just so easy to answer. So, I mean, of course, that's another great question. And this distinction between generating an emotion on the one hand and then regulating it on the other is, of course, it's really fundamental in many areas of psychology. And it's extremely useful to make that distinction often in behavioral contexts where you're a clinician who wants to try and have a working model of what's a good way to have a therapeutic intervention, whether it's a cognitive behavioral intervention, a talk therapy intervention, a psychopharmacological intervention. If you can frame that in terms of they have some type of perhaps maladaptive initial emotional response, but then you modify their ability to regulate that in some way, this distinction between generation and regulation can be very powerful and useful. But then when you start looking at the brain, things get a little more blurry, it turns out, because most of our everyday examples of emotion generation on the one hand and regulation on the other frame generation as a very automatic, obligatory, reflexive process, as if it never involves much higher order thought. And on the other hand, frame regulation as necessarily this consciously goal-driven, effortful, deliberate, time-consuming process. It turns out that's not the complete picture. And emotions can be generated through deliberative, effortful, top-down thought. If you've ever been sitting in an armchair on a fall or winter's day, as the light goes down earlier than you'd expect, you're reading a book or you're surfing the web on your computer and suddenly you notice it's gotten dark all around you. Did you lock the front door? Oh, what's that creak over there? There's a strange sound in the other room, and so on. You start cognitively elaborating a scenario that from the top down will generate an emotion. And we've actually found that that will turn on the amygdala as well. So there's a route by which controlled top-down processes, normally thought of as part of regulation, can actually be involved in the emotion generation process. And then conversely, there are forms of emotion regulation that don't require conscious top-down effort in order to change your emotional response. So for example, if you've learned that in say a classic context that's studied by animal researchers, a rat learns that a light predicts a shock. For us, you might learn that there's a particular street corner that predicts really scary traffic. So as you approach the street corner, you start getting a little anxious because it's a little dodgy. It's like, playing an old video game for the 1970s, trying to get across the street. And so you have a little anticipatory fear or anxiety as you come up to the intersection. Well, it turns out that if over time you have no negative consequences in the face of, if you're a rat, the light, or if you're a person approaching that intersection, over time you'll extinguish what was previously this anticipatory anxiety, this sort of anxious, fearful response, because you've had no negative consequence follow from that expectation. It turns out that involves completely different parts of the brain that are involved in this conscious, effortful top-down reappraisal. In fact, it just involves the brain systems that are involved in initially learning or acquiring an emotional response in the first place, and in fact, expressing that emotion. So it's as if there are forms of regulation that just happen by dint of relearning. Oh, this isn't really such a bad, scary thing anymore. And that doesn't require this effortful top-down control. So is that just learning to generate a new emotion? Is that implicitly, automatically learning to regulate it? Right? It depends, right? It depends on what the purpose is of asking the question. So, that's my long-winded roundabout way of coming back to saying whether you want to call something generation or regulation really depends on your purposes. If it's really useful to make that distinction, say in a clinical context, by all means make it. If you're a neuroscientist who's trying to characterize the operation of a specific brain system, it's not going to break down in terms of this is a regulation region or this is just a generation region. Almost never does it break down that simply.
If only emotion regulation were simple, right?
Right? If only anything we study about people were simple, I suppose neither of us would have jobs.
So thank goodness it's complicated and we don't have, short soundbite answers to everything, right?
I agree. I think there's such interest in the complexity. And I think we should be unafraid as scientists and just interested people to embrace the complexity of it and try to understand it.
Well, I think one of the really cool things you've done when you talk about embracing complexity is you've taken it to a next level of complexity by trying to look at clinical populations, right, where we know that emotion regulation goes awry. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that I've been reading about in your research, and I know a lot of people are excited about. And so, one of the questions, and this is the final question about your research, I promise, is just sort of what your thoughts are about how emotion regulation goes awry, especially in the brain for individuals individuals suffering from emotional disorders. And I know your work has looked at populations ranging from individuals with borderline personality disorder to substance abuse. What's different in these individuals?
That's another great question. So let me start to answer that question, or attempt to answer that question, by talking about our approach to taking the work we do in the laboratory with sort of typically developing adults and then applying it to these clinical contexts. So our idea, and I think this is an increasingly common one in the field, is that you first have to have a benchmark, an understanding, a model of the basic ability as it works effectively for your typically developing individual. And so in our case, we want to have these models of how different kinds of frontal systems may be involved in influencing the activity in often subcortical systems, and that in that interaction, you have regulation on the one hand and generation on the other. And that allows you to ask, okay, for a given patient population or clinical context, is there a change in the way they initially trigger or generate a response to a stimulus? So if I've got borderline personality disorder and I have fundamental affect instability and a tendency to anxiously expect and overreact to potential cues that someone's rejecting me, then I might be particularly sensitive to social stimuli, facial expressions, any cue that might remind me of a time when I was lonely or rejected, and so on. You could ask, am I just hypersensitive to those kinds of cues? On the other hand, do I have a problem marshaling cognitive resources to regulate or modify that response, or even, say, psychologically distance myself from that situation? So I don't have to be a victim of an initial impulsive tendency to say, oh, I'm really angry and anxious now because you seem to not be feeling too good about me. And so in this way, like framing things in this way, we can go in there with our experimental methods and our brain imaging techniques and then ask what's going on behaviorally and in the brain. And in the case of borderline personality disorder, one thing we found is that some of the control systems that should be signaling that, hey, I'm having an affective response now I might not want to have, those alarm systems don't seem to be operating normally in someone with borderline personality disorder. And in fact, when they try to turn down their affective response, they actually take the amygdala's response and jack it up. And the alarm system that should be saying, hey, something wrong is happening here, doesn't go off. In fact, its activity goes down. It's as if they, at baseline, when not being told to do anything, are trying to kind of keep themselves from thinking about the situation. But as soon as you force them to think about a potentially stressful situation, even if it's already having a negative impact on them, it only makes things worse for them. And they seem to be, the control system seems to be ineffective in signaling the need to regulate. So that's one interesting insight we've had about borderline using our model of emotion regulation. That's really about characterizing the nature of disordered affective response in that population. Another way you can apply these kinds of basic models of emotion regulation is in more of a treatment mode, or a mode where you want to develop or apply your, say, methods for studying emotion regulation to a clinical context where you could be helping a population learn to cope more effectively with whatever their maladaptive affective response is. And so here, there's work that we've done on substance abuse with one of your colleagues there at Yale, a former student in my lab, Hetty Gruber. She was the lead person on this work. And here we studied smokers, where the interest was in understanding how, on the one hand, a smoker might have an initial differentially strong, bottom-up, positive, appetitive craving response to a cue that reminds them of a cigarette. So it could be a photograph of a burning cigarette in someone's hand. It could be a picture of someone smoking, even just a pack of cigarettes. All of those cues are known to elicit a kind of positive affective response that leads a smoker to crave smoking a cigarette at that moment. So we can ask, do the brain systems involved in generating a positive affective response, or recognizing that's a potentially rewarding thing out there in the world, do those respond more strongly on the one hand? Or on the other, if you ask them to try and effortfully regulate that response, is there a diminishment in their capacity to turn down that response? And what was really intriguing that we found was, while sure, they have a stronger response to, say, cigarettes or cues that elicit craving for cigarettes than, say, a food cue that elicits a desire to eat that delicious chocolate sundae or that chocolate chip cookie, or, you know, in this holiday season, there's any number of temptations around. Yeah, they respond more strongly, but they're able to effectively turn it off using kind of cognitive reappraisal-like techniques from the top down. And then involve this action from prefrontal regions, turning off a region, a subcortical structure called the ventral striatum, evolutionarily old, really important for encoding things that are rewarding and reinforcing, and that in turn diminish their craving. There's this nice three-step pathway that Hetty described. What was striking is that smokers were as effective at turning down their craving for cigarettes as they were at turning down their cravings for food. And what's exciting about that is that it seems to provide an initial insight into the pathway by which treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy, which are really, really similar to the ways we study reappraisal in the lab, might be effective. And we know that cognitive behavioral therapies can be very effective for smokers. And so in this context, what we might be doing is starting to describe the brain pathways that underlie effective forms of treatment for a substance abusing population. And we can then potentially generalize that to other populations, ask how some individuals with substance abuse issues might effectively or ineffectively rely on those pathways, and so on. We're now taking this work and extending it to the study of alcohol and alcohol abuse. And I know your colleague Hetty has taken it and extended in other directions as well.
So thanks for that. I mean, and you're sort of thinking about now what is in store next, right? So this leads me to ask you, this is another easy question, but what do you see in store for the future study of emotion?
Boy, I think one of the exciting things about research is you never know what's next. Mm-hmm. One answer could be, I just don't know, because there's so many different people working on different aspects of emotion that it's hard to predict what new insights we're going to have. Another way to answer that question is to say, certainly we're going to try to deepen our understanding of the basic ways in which cortical and subcortical systems are involved in emotion generation on the one hand and regulation on the other, with, I think, in the next 10 years, we're going to describe networks for everything, where it's going to be not just parts of prefrontal cortex modulate brain systems for detecting threats or encoding rewards. It's going to be each one of those things will be more of a network. And there will be an increasing recognition that we can't understand the brain basis of any behavior, let alone emotion, in terms of a few bit part players on a stage. It's really like an orchestra, where every part of the brain is an instrument playing different kinds of notes in synchrony or asynchronously with others, in the case of dysfunction potentially. And there's something in the aggregate about the music that's made by the notes played by all these different instruments, and that you can't understand the phenomenon, in our case emotion, unless you understand the way all the instruments play together as kind of a network or a group. And I think that is a really exciting frontier for the interface between psychology and neuroscience, is how to characterize the way in which this sort of orchestra, all the instruments at play in your brain and your mind, give rise to the phenomena that we care about.
It's a really beautiful metaphor. I think a lot of people will use that as a way to guide how they think about emotion and where to go with it. And so the last question I want to ask you, Kevin, is, you know, what advice would you have for students or just people more generally who are interested in embarking in the study of this, you know, sort of confusing but beautiful orchestra, you know, of emotion?
That's a great question. I guess I think two things. So one is read a lot. You know, read broadly. Read about emotion, but also read outside of emotion research, because it might provide you with insights into the way emotion works that if you're only reading research on emotion, you might not otherwise have. So in my own example, I had a pretty big base of knowledge just about cognitive neuroscience in general and the study of memory and attention in particular. And so I used that as my foundation when I came into studying emotion. And I wasn't sort of brought up in my academic adolescence, if you will, in a lab that had strong pre-existing ideas and a long history about the way emotion was supposed to be studied. And in some sense, that might have freed me up to have an outsider's perspective on it and say, oh, okay, I can approach emotion the way a cognitive neuroscientist would. And I don't have to be beholden to any prior views necessarily. I mean, obviously that has its pluses and minuses. And once I started reading more broadly in emotion, I felt like I could integrate things in a somewhat unique way. And I think that's important for anyone interested in any phenomenon. Read not just about that phenomenon, but other allied things. You don't know where inspiration will come from. I think the other piece of advice I might give is simply to get involved in doing research. And if it weren't for the fact that I did that in my own college career, I don't think I'd be where I am today, even though I feel like this is absolutely the perfect career for me. I couldn't possibly imagine doing anything else. If I hadn't got involved in research and being on the ground in the research trenches, if you will, collecting data, running subjects, thinking hard about the phenomenon that I was studying and what it means and how do I develop methods in the lab to study, like, what am I doing? If I hadn't been doing that, I don't think I would have had the hands-on experience to ground my highfalutin interests in high-concept stuff. You know, otherwise it's kind of just, it's armchair philosophy if you don't kind of get in there and study it.
So read more and get in the trenches.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Kevin. This concludes our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Kevin Ochsner from Columbia University. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Kevin Ochsner, who's a professor of psychology at Columbia University, on emotion regulation and the brain. Dr. Ochsner received his PhD in psychology from Harvard University, where he also received postdoctoral training in social psychology. He later received additional training in functional neuroimaging at Stanford University, where he subsequently held the position of a research scientist. He's currently a professor of psychology at Columbia University and director of the Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. His lab studies the psychological and neural processes involved in emotion, self-regulation, person perception, and their interactions. He's received various awards for his research and teaching, including the American...
So many people's emotional reactions seem to be a product of their life history. So whether it was in my family or even my friends, in the neighborhood or in classes. And I found myself trying to figure out what their history was that led them to have the experiences that they had today. And although that was in some sense the seed that grew into the career I have now, one twist is that I didn't realize how much I was interested in this until I was in grad school studying something else entirely. Well, it's not something else entirely. I was studying memory and attention, and I was studying that because when I was in college, I was an engineering and English major, and I took as an elective phenomena to studying emotion and social behavior more broadly.
Very interesting. So that actually leads me to the next question I want to ask you, which is a bit about your work now on emotion. So your work has really pioneered this field that's looked at how can our brain play a role in either, kind of harnessing or reining in our emotions or really amplifying them. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you see as some of the most fundamental discoveries about neuroscience and as it relates to emotion regulation. So how does our brain really play a role in harnessing our feelings?
Well, that's a great question. And I wish it was one I could answer in 3 sound bites. I'll do my best.
Psychological Association's Division III New Investigator Award, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society's Young Investigator Award, and the Columbia University's Distinguished Faculty Award. So I now turn to our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Kevin Ochsner. So welcome, Kevin. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thanks for inviting me to talk with you.
Anytime. What I'd like to ask you about today, and what I think a lot of people would like to know, is what got you first started studying emotion in the first place? Can you tell us a bit about that journey?
Sure. I guess for most people, or at least in my case, it starts when I was just a grade school student. And I started noticing that what now would be called mind, brain, and behavior. I loved it. One of the professors got me working in her lab. I thought that was really fun, but she studied attention, and I worked in a couple other labs that studied memory, and I thought this is really cool. But I didn't realize that what I thought was really cool was working in those labs, not necessarily the content of the science. And I went to grad school to study memory and attention. And not that those aren't perfectly worthy topics to study. They're wonderful. They just weren't for me. And about 2 months into grad school, I realized I needed to study emotion. But I hadn't until that point realized you could do that as a career. And from then, I started slowly but surely changing my trajectory away from straight cognitive